Okay, so welcome everybody once again. I did formal welcomes before we began this recording, so I'm going to jump into introducing our guests. Our guests, because I see Zach on my left, one of our first guests is an old and dear friend of mine, Zachary Levine. He is the director for archival and curatorial affairs in the National Museum for the Holocaust Documentation at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where he serves as the vice chair on the Council of American, and he serves, excuse me, as the vice chair on the Council of American Jewish Museums. I met Zach in part because he's a trained historian of East and Central Europe, specializing in Jewish history, the Cold War, and international philanthropy. Zach has worked at Yeshiva University Museum in New York City and the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., as the director of exhibits and collections. Before joining the USHMM, Zach also worked freelance with a number of different museums and artists, and I've really always admired his work, and it's a pleasure to be able to present it, Zach, here to present it to you. Sophia Zohar is someone who I've met face-to-face for the first time about 8 minutes ago, but I've followed her for quite some time on Twitter, where she goes under the handle Maimonides Nuts, and I will allow her to explain what that means. She is a Jewish writer, artist, and internet personality residing in the Bay Area. She is best known for her absurd Jewish memes and the creation of the Jewish goth aesthetic. And you can find this primarily on her apparel line, with the website for which I've shared with my students, and I can throw up in the chat over here later on. I don't want to take up too much time. I will say what drew me to Ms. Zohar's work, and what made me want to invite her is, first, the art itself I find interesting and nice, but I'm also interested in sort of the place of the artist and art in this digital Jewish community, because that already changes the frame, I think, in how we have to approach things and think about things. But you're not here to hear from me, so I'll first start with Zachary Levine. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Great to be here, and thanks, Jacob, for inviting me. I'm going to take it that everybody can hear me. All right. I'm going to share my screen if I can find it. There we are. Shared. Cool. So I am going to go really fast, and I will apologize if I either gloss over something or get it wrong or anything like that. So I'm going to talk about what is Jewish, in parentheses, visual art. How do we sort of understand what this is? And again, I'm going to kind of fly through this, especially if I can. There we are. So Jewish visual art is an expression of an idea related to or an interpretation of something, of a thing. It's kind of like all art. It relates almost usually to an event in Jewish history or Jewish culture, and that's defined by the artist. It frequently, the art itself, it adapts and embeds Jewish ideas in forms that are taken from the surrounding culture by and large. So, you know, it could be, if it's in Turkey, it takes from the Turkish culture. If it's from Africa, it takes from, you know, that part of Africa, and so on and so forth. Typically, Jewish art has been made historically to be consumed by a Jewish audience. And how you define Jewish is a little bit, you know, that's sort of up to the interpreter, but we're talking about the intent here. But the other thing about this kind of art is that it can also be an expression of identity that is meant for both Jewish, but also for non-Jewish consumption. Okay, and now cool. But if we really want to get down to like, what is Jewish visual art? It is the byproduct of a relationship and an interaction with a particular textual tradition and historical experiences and memories. That, to put it really simply, there is really like no one way to define an aesthetic for Jewish art. Rather, it's about the relationship to Jewish text and the way that Jews have read and interpreted that text over thousands of years. I'm going to be a little bit all over historically, but I want to show you a couple of different examples of types of Jewish art, for want of a better term. So this is, I'll show you a couple images of this. This is the Dura Europos synagogue. It was originally built and probably painted starting in 240 CE in southeastern Syria. It was called Dura Europus, meaning the like dura, like your skin, the outside of Europe. That's what it was referred to when it was discovered in the 1920s. It was then excavated in 1932, and Dura Europus was a whole town, and the synagogue was part of a kind of Greek cultural town at this time. What's important to note is that this synagogue was on the same street with other houses of worship that were not Jewish. The murals no longer, they were taken a long time ago and put into a museum in Damascus. The original structure was sadly destroyed by ISIS in 2013, but the murals are still preserved and accessible, I understand, in the museum in Damascus. So let's look at a couple of these images. First of all, what you notice is that they are very much borrowing from a kind of Greek aesthetic, an ancient Syrian Greek aesthetic. The upper panel, though, is showing us images that come both from biblical stories, but also from other parts of Jewish textual tradition. So the top is the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea from the Exodus. The below is the temple. The temple not necessarily mentioned in that part of the Bible, but rather something that has been that is from Jewish history, that is referenced subsequently and later in Jewish texts. Another example here, this represents Ezekiel. This is coming from the Mishnah, from the center of the Jewish oral tradition. This represents Ezekiel being set down by God's hands among the dry bones. This is coming from, from the text from Ezekiel, from a different part of the Jewish Bible. And here we actually see Ezekiel in three forms. I wish I had a laser. I don't know how to do that. In three forms, hearing God, witnessing God, and then witnessing the resurrection of God in the world to come. Let's fast forward now to a different type of, well, here, I'll go back real quick. The whole point here is that we see all of these different types of styles, but all of them rooted in one form or another in Jewish text and Jewish history. Here is something a little bit more contemporary from the 17th century. And I'm gonna say that pretty much everything that I'm gonna show you, I've either worked with directly or it has been somehow been related to a project that I've done. So that's how I came to know these. So this is not comprehensive by any extent. This is a ketubah, a Jewish wedding contract from Venice from 1648. And it was very common, it's still very common for Jewish wedding contracts to be decorated around the margins. In this case, this is this incredibly luxurious contract that on first glance appears to come right out of early modern Europe. It's got these bright colors, it's got floral patterns and so on. But when we drill down and we look on the this close-up on the right side of your screen, what you see are a number of Jewish images and a number of references to Jewish text and culture. You see the heraldic lion, which is common in many forms, but in this case, it's drawing from the idea of the Lion of Judah. There are depictions of various wedding scenes of Boaz and other parts of Jewish Bible. Some of these, the Hebrew words that you see around are from the Song of Songs in the Bible. But you also see images, and this was especially common. You can actually see it going all the way around the area of the text that are about the signs of the zodiac, referencing the Jewish lunar calendar. So it's this whole big mix and mishmash of symbols, but all of it in this case in the vernacular of early modern and Italianate art. Here's another ketubah from the same collection, this one from the 14th century, but this was from Nablus or Shechem. This is a Samaritan ketubah. The Samaritans were a sect that diverged from rabbinic Judaism a long time ago. What's interesting here is that whereas this Venetian version of a ketubah is showing you're seeing people, you're seeing animals, and so on, this one is in many ways conforms to the religious strictures of life under Islamic tradition, but also a different interpretation of Jewish tradition. You see no images of animals or people. And in fact, what you see at the top of the decorative part is a half moon and star, which is an explicit reference to the Ottoman Empire, to Ottoman rule in this period. So in fact, there's a political connotation on this wedding contract. I'm gonna stream through now. Again, from the Brzezinski collection, which you should look up Brzezinski collection. It's just an incredible resource of Jewish rare books. On the left, you see the Masechet Purim, which is, in this case, it is a, it's not Masechet from the Talmud. It's a volume that's a satire on the Purim holiday. And what we see here is something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in a religious book, or a book that in this case is using a kind of script Hebrew. This is showing these playing cards, but it's an explicit reference to the commandment for Jews to, I believe it's to like play dice and enjoy themselves and almost gamble during this particular holiday. So you see this thing that seems to have absolutely no relationship, but it is adjacent to the to the Hebrew text. On the right side of your screen, you see an Esther scroll from India from 1900. And what's fascinating about this is that all of the characters whose names are marked in Hebrew, and this is a particular scene from the Purim story, appear as not just Indian people, but they are in a mix of Western and different types of Western garb that have been infused. I would say Indian garb that's infused with Western influences, especially if you see in the center on the bottom, Mordechai, who's one of the main characters in the story, is dressed as a symbol of authority in this Indian culture from this period. Okay, again with our survey. Now I'm going to get into the text itself in a sense. So what we see here are two separate pages from the Talmud, sort of the core of Jewish legal tradition. If you take including the Bible, if you look on the left side, you'll see this sort of rectangle of text with a blank space on the inside. That's called the Mishnah. That's the oral history. That's the oral tradition. Around it is the Gemara, the interpretation of what's in there from different rabbis from a very long period. This is from the tractate or the Eruvs are this conceptual boundary that Jewish communities sometimes create around themselves so that their members can carry on the Sabbath. The reason why you have these, and this particular version that you see here from 1645 was one of the best printed versions at the time. Why does it have these blank spaces? Well, because to understand the text here, the reader was invited to actually draw in the concepts about space in those blank spots. On the Masechet, or the page on the other side of your screen, on the right side, you see a Talmud that was published in between 1511 and 1519, the same book. But in this case, the author actually printed those images in there. I want to also, just as an aside, get you to note two things. One is that the pages themselves have an architecture to them. They have an entire shape that you can decide whether or not it is or isn't art, but it is part of the Jewish visual culture. It is something that that is coming out of this Jewish textual tradition. The other thing is that this was so important, this particular book and argument was so important for Jewish communities that it in fact was probably one of the first 100 books that was actually printed instead of written. You would see that it was printed in 1511 to 1519. In fact, this particular volume called the Pizarro was printed in several towns, as the Sanchinos who printed it had to move from town to town to town as they were escaping the Inquisition. But that's an aside. Now I bring up this Eruv thing, and I know I'm going like crazy, because it actually leads to the creation and formalization of a kind of pictograph or set of pictographs that define Jewish space in terms of this Eruv, how you understand what's a corner, what's a corridor, how do you understand what is private and public space. You don't really have to understand the Eruv, but rather looking at this sort of gloss glossary in a sense of these different types of images from 1900. This was an attempt to actually standardize these images that you see on the right side of your screen, or that would have gone into the blank spaces on the left side, to standardize them. And now if you look in a Talmud that's printed today, you will see these exact same images. They are, in fact, coming directly out of this Jewish textual tradition, this idea of Eruv and how to understand it. Okay. And Jacob, I have to apologize for using the old new synagogue. I'm sure you're tired of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit very briefly about synagogue architecture. Right here is the old new synagogue, the Altnai synagogue in Prague. That was one of the oldest standing synagogues in the world from 1270. There's a number of things here that are extremely common to both church and synagogue architecture from the medieval period. The vaulted ceilings that you see on the right side, these two pillars in the center. If you go to any synagogue or church from this period, it's very likely that it will conform to this architecture. On the other hand, what you also see in the center between the two columns is something that is for synagogue architecture. It's the place where the Torah, where the leader for the service stands. There's a blue table there with the where the Torah is read. Above it, you actually see this flag, which is a reproduction, or no, maybe that is the original. I think it's a reproduction of the original. No, right. I see it. It's a reproduction of a flag that was created to represent the Jewish community in Prague and Bohemia. You see you see similar familiar images like the six-pointed star, which was only adopted far after the biblical period, probably around this period, and an image of a hat, which was supposedly commonly worn by Jews in this period. I want to also focus you on one other thing. On the lower left side of your corner of your screen is this cover over where the ark is. What's important to note here is that this cover was made maybe, I don't know what, 6 years ago, but it conforms to a particular set of, I think, conventions with how these ark covers are created. If you look really closely, you'll see two heraldic lions. You'll see these Torah pointers, these yads or hands on both sides of that, which represent columns that reference both the columns of the temple, but also Ezra and Nehemiah. In this case, the artist referenced the two columns that you see holding up the roof of the synagogue that you see in the left and the right side of your screen. I can go on, but I'm going to move on to something that's more recent about Jewish architecture. This is from 2010 from a competition called Sukkah City, where artists and architects were invited from all over the world to come up with designs for sukkahs, which is a kind of hut that many Jews erect and basically live in for a week, a year in the fall to commemorate the end of the 40-year exodus in the desert. In all of these cases, the designers or the architects took the rules for what a sukkah needed to be. It had to be temporary. It had to have a roof that allowed stars to come in. It usually it has a wooden roof. All of these cases draw from that. It could not be complete. It had to have a hole in it so that people could enter and exit, but also to commemorate, in many cases, to commemorate the loss of the Second Temple. All of these are trying to conform to that, those strictures, yet they come in very, very different aesthetic forms. And incidentally, this one on the left side, on the right side, that looks sort of like a pineapple met a toilet plunger. If there's time, I will tell you about my experience trying to get it into a building that it was 6 feet too tall to get into. At 3 a.m, getting it up Fifth Avenue on a movable crane in New York in the middle of the night. It was bonkers. Anyway, all right. I want to get back now to the contemporary period. So on your right side, you've got Ben Zion. Ben Zion was a primitivist artist who had a sort of spark of fame, I guess, in the contemporary art period or scene in New York in the 1950s and 60s. And the thing that was so remarkable about him is that he attracted a tremendous amount of attention from the art crowd generally, but much of his work was focused on Jewish themes, either biblical scenes like this one from Job or a lot of rabbis, things like this. On the left side, or on the right side, you see a piece by Lee Krasner. This is a piece that has nothing to do with Jewish art per se, but I raise it for two reasons. One is Krasner came from an Orthodox family. She was very aware of her Jewish ancestry, her Jewish roots, and her Jewish identity. And though it didn't come out in her art per se, I raise it because there is, I think, a convention of thinking, which is borne out in truth in some respects, that abstract expressionism itself comes out of Jewish historical experience among many of its practitioners. It's the people who are trying to react in some respects to World War II, but in many cases to the Holocaust and the destruction that the Holocaust brought to what they saw as European culture and Jewish culture. And so the creation of this abstract expressionism was, as an innovation, was a way to break with that. And finally, I want to get to the contemporary period. And now we're sort of diverging a bit from my part of my definition. On the left, you will see Kehinde Wiley's Aliyos Itzhak, or the World Stage, called Israel, which he created in 2011 and is now in the Jewish Museum's collection. And this, I think you'll note, is remarkably similar both to that Ark cover from Prague, but also to the Ketubas that I showed you earlier, with both with its luxurious stylization, but also with its references to biblical scenes, the signs of the zodiac and other animals and so on. But in this case, the subject is not somebody that you would call conventionally Jewish, which is to say, in many people's thinking, a white European. But in fact, what Kehinde Wiley, who's not Jewish himself, but has worked in these themes for well over a decade, puts into place an African American. So it is now questioning the purpose of these Jewish, I think that the foundations of Jewish art and its impulses. On the right side is a piece by an artist, Quentin Wixrow, from her series Catadores Scavengers. And it's a series in which Wixrow uses cameras from particular places that are somehow related to sites where there have been atrocities in the past. That atrocity could have been 5 minutes ago, it could have been 5,000 years ago. And what she's taken a picture of here is the site in Porto. And she's got multiple exposures over an entire roll of film, and this is one part of it, where she's showing a picture of that site in the presence as a way to communicate a feeling of loss and the reverberation of the Inquisition from that place. So while we don't necessarily see the interaction with text or anything like that, rather we see an artist who is hinting at Jewish history and Jewish experience and trying to get us not to see that experience, but in fact to feel that experience. Thanks, everybody. Another question is, how do I get out of this? Anybody know? Oh, good, thank you. You're muted, Jacob.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. That was a tremendous amount of materials and a lot to think about, but I think an important tour through just sort of highlights of Jewish art to show them how multifaceted it is and how difficult this conversation can be. And so now I'll just turn the discussion over to Ms. Zohar.
Thank you. Okay. So my name is Sophia, but on the internet, I am known as Maimonides Nuts. I came up with that user or pseudonym in the middle of the night in a burst of insanity. I wrote it down and then laughed to myself for about 10 minutes and then went back to sleep. So around September 2019, I started tweeting under that name about Judaism, my own journey with Judaism, mostly a lot of memes about mostly the religious part, like turning the Jewish text into modern meme format. And I started gaining a following pretty quickly, which is now called Jewish Twitter, which is a group of people who are mostly Jewish, and they all come together to joke about Judaism. And And I also put photoshopped like sunglasses onto Maimonides, who was a 12th century Jewish philosopher. He was born in Spain and kind of went down into North Africa. And people started asking me for t-shirts with the picture on them. But the picture was too small. So I taught myself digital art on my iPad and started selling them. And it's spread pretty wide. I've had over 3,000 sales of my products. And I think people really respond to what I'm doing because I talk very honestly and openly, and I have no shame. Like, I cannot believe half the things I have said, or that people still like me and want to talk to me after saying them. Okay, so I'll give some examples. The first one would be Berachot 62a, which is from the Talmud that Zachary was talking about. It's a weird story. It's a divergence. They're talking about when to say the Shema, which is a very important Jewish prayer. And the Talmud kind of goes on these rambling journeys where they get off topic for a while. In this one, it tells the story of when Rav Kahana lies under his mentor's bed to learn how to have sex while his mentor is with his wife. And should I read it out loud or? Yeah. On a similar note, the Gemara relates that Rav Kahana entered and lay beneath Rav's bed. He heard Rav chatting and laughing with his wife and seeing to his needs, i.e. having relations with her. Rav Kahana said to Rav, "The mouth of Ava, Rav, is like one whom has never eaten a cooked dish," i.e. his behavior was lustful. Rav said to him, "Kahana, you are here? Leave, as this is an undesirable mode of behavior." Rav Kahana said to him, "It is Torah and I must learn." And so someone shared this into Jewish Twitter, and everyone just immediately just started laughing about it because it's a ridiculous story, and it's not what I expected to read in the Talmud, which I didn't know much about, but I kind of thought it wasn't. I come from a secular background, and I never occurred to me to read the Talmud or what I might find in it, but this was not what I expected to find in it. So yeah, to this day, this was in October of 2019. To this day, you'll see people drawing back on Jewish Twitter to this story with the phrase, "It is Torah and I must learn." And so I, at one point, decided I wanted to draw. I was just getting into the art and playing with my program. And so I decided to draw the scene. And I think this kind of, I call it Talmud fan art. So, you know, in internet culture, people will draw art of their favorite characters or of points in the story that they kind of want pictures of. And so I decided that we needed that for this story. And then I now sell it on a mug, and the proceeds, some of them go to Safaria, which is a non-profit that makes all Jewish texts accessible to anyone. You can just go on their site and look at the Talmud, the Torah, pretty much. They just have a wide variety of stuff. And I put it on a pair of leggings, which became known as the forbidden leggings. I wrote in the description on the website, "Please don't buy these. I just made them as a joke." But they've sold quite a few pairs. So on the leg with the Hebrew, that's the story in Hebrew. And then on the other side on the butt, they say, "It is Torah and I must learn." And putting things on the butt is a meme in itself. Like, people will say booty shorts, but they say X on the butt, and what's on the butt is ridiculous. Yeah, and then the next one was, I kind of enjoy the goth culture. I used to work at a goth fashion company, and like for Shabbat, I wanted longer skirts, and the only sort of goth is really lends itself to that because there are a lot of long skirts, but a lot of goth fashion sort of revolves around like the cross and sort of Catholic aesthetics and rejection of the Catholic Church. And so my thought is that Jewish goth is a very different matter because we have a very different relationship to death than maybe the Catholics do. Like it's much more in that sort of romantic tradition of the sublime and communing with something bigger than it is about fear. So on one side, you'll have the goth chai, which is, I kind of created a thorny Jewish, a thorny font that you see on a lot of goth fashion. And I used it to write out the word chai, which in Hebrew means life. And the letters equal, there's a tradition where you add up the letters, each letter has a value, and you add them up. And there's a whole lot of analysis around what words have the same value. So chai equals 18, which is a very lucky number in Jewish tradition. During bat mitzvahs and other happy events, people will give money in multiples of 18. So I liked that juxtaposition of life, but kind of decaying. And the other one is emet, which means truth. And it is calling back the folklore around the golem, which is a figure animated of clay to protect the Jewish people from harm. But they usually get out of control and go on a rampage. And in my own art, I use the golem as a metaphor a lot. So in this one, in order to deactivate the golem, you smear out the olive, and it turns the word from truth to death. So the metal part of this one is that the olive is only half smeared, and sort of what does that mean? And just with COVID, the company I work with started selling masks. So having this message on a mask has been really, really popular with people. And then for the last one, I'll do a lot of illustrations around sort of a piece of scripture that I find interesting. This one says, circumcise the foreskin of your heart and stiffen your necks no more. You can also find it in the Yom Kippur liturgy. So I came from a secular background and started going to a traditional shul about 3 years ago now. And so last year, I really encountered this in the liturgy for the first time, and nothing was said about it. It was just there. It was just supposed to go on and go to the next page and not think about how it says circumcise the foreskin of your heart. So I wanted to illustrate it. So that is a picture of an anatomical heart, and what is going through it is the knife used in the bris, which is the ceremony where you circumcise the kid. So it's about taking these, and the top is the Hebrew for the scripture, but in Hebrew cursive. And yeah, so for me, it's about making these kind of weird pieces, just pointing them out in a humorous and new way. And I think that's what people really respond to in my work. Yeah, so that's about what I have here. You can find me on Twitter, or you can find my work in my store, which Jacob posted a link to. Yeah.
So thank you very much as well. I will stop participating. Sharing. There we go. Thank you very, very much as well. That was, I think these two talks went very well together, even sharing a Prague theme, which I write about, or used to write about, and one day will again write about Czech Jewry, and have spent a lot of time in the Old New Synagogue. And the Old New Synagogue is a center place of one of the most important and well-known stories of the Golem. So these really hang together neatly in my head. But since we only have about 10 minutes left, I want to open the floor to students who have questions.
I just had a quick question. I know, Zachary, you said in your presentation that there is no specific aesthetic to Jewish art, but is there a period of art or a style of art that you associate with Jewish art more?
No. I don't. No, no, because there's no, Judaism itself is not monolithic. There are Jews all over the place at different times, and the visual culture or visual cultures and visual artifacts that they create for themselves and for others just vary wildly. I mean, I think that that said, there are certain types of forms of artistic expression that maybe have been identified with Jews, but I can't say that there's anything that's endogenous. Really, you've got to think about Jewish art not as the thing itself, but as the product of a relationship between Jews and textual tradition, which is in some ways kind of easy, because then you don't have to, there's no essence to it. There's no core thing there.
So maybe I'll ask a question while we're waiting, and it has to do with sort of and maybe I'll ask both of you, and building off of Ms. Zohar's work, because of the way that we now have sort of a global internet, right? We now have an internet where this art is moving very differently. I don't have to go to Syria to look at it. And certainly we're of the same time, but is there a changing in the dynamic in some way? And I know this is sort of not a well thought through question, but what has this hyper globalization, this easy sharing done to Jewish art? Like, what has what I perceive to be increasingly porous boundaries of what is Jewish done to Jewish art? And in that case, are there limits, right? Are there limits where we say, no, this is not like this?
I'm happy to talk, although Sophia, by all means, feel free. So if anything, I think there's two factors. One is, if we were to ask the question, what is this done for or to Jewish art? I think in some ways it's made it more varied. And in the same way that just as it has been for all types of fine art, craft, however you want to describe it, I think there's a general democratization of who makes this, who has access to it, and so on. So there's more of it and many more types, but I don't know if the types, the sort of multiplicity of types or forms or whatever you want to say, is really all that different from what we've had in the past. There's just more of it. Now, with that said, I think that you probably could make the case that there are more people who do not identify themselves as Jews working in Jewish art. Now, that's not to say that many or any of them are creating only bodies of work that have to do with Jewish topics. Rather, I think that many of them, just like artists who happen to also be Jewish, will create a body of work that is somehow about Jewish experience, identity. It's probably an expression of their own relationship to Judaism, but it won't necessarily be the only thing that they create. So all of this is to say that there's a lot more Jewish art out there, but the people who are creating it and the reasons that they create it, I think that is probably changing, but that too is probably an artifact of just the way that our culture is, I think, more fragmentary than it used to be than we perceive it as having been in the past.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I just say in terms of the internet, there's this whole wave of younger people or people around my age in their 20s to 30s getting sort of returning to Judaism, where they're kind of realizing they've been alienated and they're trying to get back involved. And of course, it's going to bring a lot of artists as well, and a lot more art. So there's this whole culture of artists who work in sort of Jewish themes. And now, like I said, with Safaria, they have more access to the material on which to relate to it. And then they have a whole community who sort of trades ideas back and forth. Like I've kind of think I've seen my ideas sort of reflected in work that other people do. And I've definitely drawn on other artists who I met online for my own work. So I think it's the creation of a Jewish community online and the new forms of art, like making art specifically as graphics for Instagram, which I do a bit of, or I don't know, people wanting more ways to express their Jewishness. So a lot of people have started making more Jewish wearable art. Yeah, so the spread definitely helps.
Thank you. I mean, that was something you really articulated there, something that I've been thinking about and not able to put my finger on. And I don't know if Zach shares this as well. Like, this was not available for Zach and me when we were in our 20s and even in our early 30s. It just didn't really exist. And I find myself jealous and deeply impressed with this new, very playful and far more informed, partly because you said now you can jump on Safaria community and what it's creating. And that's really something that I thank you for capturing in that way, because it's been, first of all, inspiring for me, but I think the way you explained it makes it relevant in a really clear way to my students. We have time for about one more quick question.
I just want to say one thing, because it's not just that I agree, but I think that actually this is, it's a technological issue as much as a cultural issue. And in the sense that, again, Jacob and I are, a couple of months apart. I would say when I was in my 20s and sort of thinking about this stuff, there were a couple of publications that were trying to be outlets for what they would have described as radical Jewish culture, or something that's sort of on the edge. That you would have had autonomous organizations that would have crept up, but it was really a sort of middle space. That it was only with the creation of digital material, of digital access to all of these materials, and the democratization of Jewish culture through digital means, that it becomes possible for this volume of creativity to be accessible to so many people. I think you're right on there.
In that case, I just want to give another profound thank you to our guests, Zachary Levine and Sophia Zohar. I encourage you to check out their work. I will put, for my students, I'll send you these things again. All right, I'm looking forward to reading about this in my student reflection papers and to seeing the rest of you at some events soon. Have a nice day. Bye, everybody.